The silence in the private dining room of Sakura's Peak, a restaurant perched atop a Manhattan skyscraper like a jewel in a crown, was of a particularly brutal kind. It wasn't empty. It was dense, heavy with the ghosts of unspoken words and the bitter taste of catastrophic failure. Outside, the city glittered, a galaxy of ambition and connection. Inside, two galaxies were drifting apart, their gravitational pull failing. On one side of the expansive, gloss-black table sat Julian Croft, the 38-year-old wunderkind CEO of Nexus Forge, a tech behemoth that had devoured its competition with the cold, algorithmic efficiency of its founder. His face, usually plastered on magazine covers with a confident smirk, was a tight mask of controlled fury. His knuckles were white where he gripped a titanium pen, not for noting, but for anchoring himself in the storm of his own unraveling deal. This merger with Tanaka Heavy Industries was his magnum opus, the bridge between his disruptive New World tech and their century-old legacy of precision engineering. It was a deal worth $12 billion, but at that moment it wasn't worth the cold, untouched Wagyu steak sitting before him. Opposite sat Mr. Kenji Tanaka, a man in his late 70s whose posture was a testament to a lifetime of discipline. His face, a landscape of dignified wrinkles, was as impassive as a no mask. He was flanked by his two senior advisors, their silence a perfect, synchronized echo of his own. For 4 agonizing hours, a negotiation that was supposed to be a final, celebratory signing had devolved into a slow, excruciating death by 1,000 cultural cuts. Their highly paid interpreter, a man with a flawless academic grasp of Japanese, had been dismissed 2 hours prior. He could translate words, but he could not translate meaning, and Julian Croft, a man who thought in binary, had finally lost his patience with the nuances. Now, they were left with a chasm of misunderstanding, and the only thing being communicated was mutual, profound disappointment. Clara Evans felt the chill the moment she pushed the service door open, a lacquered tray bearing a fresh pot of Gyokuro tea balanced perfectly on one palm. She wasn't meant to be in this room. This was the domain of the senior waitstaff, the veterans who moved with the silent, practiced grace of shadows. But Maria had gotten a frantic call about a sick child, and the Nexus Forge party was a high-alert, all-hands-on-deck affair. Clara, with her quiet competence and an almost supernatural ability to be unobtrusive, was deemed the least disruptive replacement. Her job was simple: serve the tea, clear the cups, and vanish. But as she moved around the room, the oppressive silence was punctuated by the grating, desperate attempts of Julian's junior executive, Marcus Thorne, a slick young man whose ambition oozed from the pores of his overpriced suit. "Mr. Tanaka," Marcus said, leaning forward with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Julian, Mr. Croft, he simply means the synergy will be explosive. Big. Boom!" He made a small, pathetic explosion gesture with his hands. Mr. Tanaka watched the pantomime with a glacial expression before murmuring something in low, melodic Japanese to his advisor. The advisor responded in a tone that, even without understanding the words, felt as sharp and cold as a shard of ice. Clara froze for a nanosecond, her hand hovering over a porcelain cup. She understood every single syllable. "He thinks we are children," Mr. Tanaka had said, his voice laced with a deep weariness. "He describes a partnership of legacies with the vocabulary of a cartoon." His advisor had replied, "It is as I feared. They see our history not as a foundation, but as a decoration. They wish to buy the temple, but they do not understand the god." Clara's heart began a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. A flush of heat crept up her neck. It had been years since she'd been immersed in the language of her grandmother, the language of her own childhood. It was a part of her soul she had been forced to lock away, a beautiful, intricate garden left to wither behind a steel door. Her entire youth, her sense of self, had been shaped by the quiet wisdom and elegant cadences of her Japanese grandmother, a woman who had taught her more about honor and patience than any school ever could. That world had been snatched away, leaving her here, pouring tea for men who were trampling over the very culture she held sacred. She continued her circuit of the table, her movements on autopilot. Her mind, however, was a maelstrom. She saw her grandmother's hands, painstakingly mending a shattered ceramic bowl with lines of gold lacquer. Kintsugi, she had called it. "We do not hide the breaks, Akiko-chan," she would say, using Clara's Japanese name. "We honor them. The piece is more beautiful for having been broken." Clara's life had been broken. Her grandmother's death when she was 16, followed by her mother's long, expensive illness, had shattered her dreams of studying art history in college. The vibrant, promising future of a gifted student had been replaced by the immediate, crushing reality of medical bills and the responsibility of caring for her younger brother, Sam. The life of the mind had vanished, replaced by the life of aching feet, 12-hour shifts, and the forced smile of the service industry. Marcus Thorne, ever desperate to impress, suddenly brandished his phone. "I have an app, Mr. Croft. It's state-of-the-art, AI-driven. I can get the gist of what he's saying." Julian looked at him, with the vacant stare of a man who had already accepted defeat. "Go ahead, Marcus. Can't make it any worse." Marcus cleared his throat, and, pointing the phone at Mr. Tanaka, spoke a clumsy, grammatically mangled sentence he'd clearly typed into the device. He was attempting to ask about a specific clause in the contract related to the company's founding principles, but what the robotic female voice from the phone chirped out was a jumbled mess that sounded more like an inquiry about the building's foundation. Clara winced internally. It wasn't just wrong, it was deeply insulting. He was taking a concept the Japanese held sacred, the spiritual and philosophical core of their company, and reducing it to a question of literal bricks and mortar. Mr. Tanaka's eyes narrowed. A muscle in his jaw twitched. He said nothing, but he reached for his silk napkin, folded it with meticulous precision, and placed it on the table beside his untouched plate. It was a gesture of absolute finality. It was a signal that the dinner and the $12 billion deal was over. Eleanor Vance, Nexus Forge's COO and the only other person on the American side who seemed to possess a shred of emotional intelligence, saw it too. A flicker of panic crossed her face. "Julian," she murmured, a clear warning in her tone. Julian Croft's composure finally shattered. He didn't shout. He did something much more terrifying. He slammed his titanium pen down on the table. The sharp crack echoed in the silent room like a gunshot. "This is a farce," he hissed, his voice low and shaking with a rage born of pure frustration. "Years of work, billions of dollars in shareholder value, evaporated, all because no one in this God-forsaken room can speak a simple, coherent sentence to each other." The silence that followed was absolute, heavier and more suffocating than before. The weight of it pressed down on everyone. Clara stood by the service station, tray in hand, an invisible refugee caught in the crossfire of a corporate war. She saw the deal dying. She saw the bewildered frustration on the American faces and the cold, resolute dismissal on the Japanese faces. But more than that, she heard the silent screams of miscommunication, of cultural ignorance. She saw the beautiful, profound philosophy of her grandmother being caricatured and dismissed as illogical nonsense. And in that moment, a reckless, terrifying thought ignited in her mind. A thought that could get her fired, humiliated, and cast out onto the street. Or maybe, just maybe, it could mend what was broken. The air in the room was now thick with the metallic tang of failure. Julian Croft's contained explosion had shattered the last, fragile veneer of corporate civility, exposing the raw, ugly truth of their impasse. He was breathing heavily, his face flushed, his eyes darting between the impassive Japanese contingent and his own crestfallen team. He looked like a king who had lost his empire in a game of charades. Mr. Tanaka pushed his chair back slightly, the legs making a soft, mournful sound against the polished floorboards. It was the unmistakable signal of departure. His associates began to quietly gather their leather-bound portfolios, their movements crisp and final. The end had arrived. "Wait!" Eleanor Vance pleaded, her voice calm but strained. She leaned across the table, trying to catch Mr. Tanaka's eye. "Tanaka-san, please. There is simply a barrier. The fundamentals of this deal, the logic, it's sound." Mr. Tanaka looked at her, and for the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed his face. It was pity. He responded in Japanese, his voice even and measured, directed at his colleagues, but meant for the entire room to feel, if not comprehend. Clara, standing by the wall, felt the words like a physical blow. "The fundamentals are irrelevant if the soul is absent," Mr. Tanaka stated. "They speak of logic, but they do not understand respect. How can we entrust our family's name to those who cannot even be bothered to understand our heart?" Marcus Thorne, ever the fool, raised his phone again. "Sir, the app says he's concerned about the soul and the heart of the family. It's very poetic." It was a clumsy, literal, and utterly useless translation that missed the entire essence of the statement. Julian's face contorted in frustration. What the hell does that even mean? The heart? Are we in business, or are we writing greeting cards? This is what I'm talking about. We offer them the most advanced AI integration platform on the planet, and they talk about souls. I think he means the core values, sir, Marcus stammered, sweating now. The respect for the brand identity. It was getting worse. Marcus's fumbling was like throwing sand on a delicate machine. He was reducing Mr. Tanaka's profound statement about legacy, honor, and mutual respect into the sterile, meaningless jargon of a marketing seminar. Clara watched this slow-motion catastrophe with a clarity that was both a blessing and a curse. This wasn't about language, it was about worldview. Julian Croft saw this as a transaction, a simple matter of data, assets, and efficiency. For Mr. Tanaka, a man who headed a company his great-grandfather had founded in a small workshop in Osaka, this was about legacy. It was about giri, a sacred sense of duty, and Shinrai, a deep, unwavering trust that could never be conveyed by an app or a terrified junior executive with a cheap suit. She felt a strange, protective anger rise within her, an artist's indignation at seeing a masterpiece being finger-painted by a child. These were not just words, they were vessels of history, philosophy, and identity. Marcus was shattering the vessels and showing Julian the broken shards, pretending it was the whole picture. Her own life had been shaped by the weight of words, the carefully chosen Japanese words of comfort from her grandmother, the stark, unforgiving words on the hospital bills, the humiliating words of the community college administrator explaining why her financial aid had run out. "The rules are quite clear, Ms. Evans. We can't make exceptions." Words had broken her world. Maybe, just maybe, they could also put it back together. Mr. Tanaka was now standing. His associates followed suit. He gave a short, formal bow, a gesture of finality that needed no translation. "Croft-san," he said, the single English word sounding alien and final on his tongue. Julian stood, his face ashen. He had lost. Years of planning, of aggressive acquisitions and ruthless strategy, all culminating in this humiliating defeat in a hushed dining room. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. What could he say? Shout louder? Make bigger hand gestures? This was the abyss, the absolute event horizon of failure. Clara's feet felt nailed to the floor. Her training, her very instinct for survival in the service industry, screamed at her to remain invisible. Getting involved was professional suicide. They wouldn't thank her. They would resent her for witnessing their humiliation, for daring to step outside her designated role. She would be fired on the spot. And Sam was counting on her paycheck for his textbooks, for the field trip fee she'd promised him. But then, as Mr. Tanaka began to turn, one of his associates muttered a final, biting comment to his colleague. It was a low, conspiratorial whisper, not meant for anyone else to hear. "Shikata ga nai. It is as you predicted. American impatience. They have no stomach for the slow path. They build things that glitter, but do not last." That was it. That was the final push. It wasn't about the deal anymore. It wasn't about Julian Croft's pride. It was about something deeper. It was about the pride of her grandmother. It was about defending a philosophy of patience, of honoring the past, of building things that last. It was the pride of the artist she was meant to be. Before her conscious mind could erect its wall of fear, before the terror of unemployment could paralyze her limbs, Clara took a single, deliberate step forward from the shadows of the service station. Her voice, when it came out, was quiet. Yet it cut through the funereal silence of the room with the clarity of a temple bell. She didn't speak to Julian. She didn't speak to his team. She looked directly at Mr. Kenji Tanaka, who had his back half-turned towards her. And in flawless, deeply respectful, formal Japanese, the kind one learns at a grandparent's knee, not in a classroom, she said, "Tanaka-sama osorerimasu. Sashi de gamashi koto de gozaimasu ga, ima no o kotoba, sukoshi bakari chigau ka to zonjimasu." The room went utterly still. The world seemed to stop for a full 5 seconds. The only sound was the faint, distant hum of the city far below. Clara's words, clear and perfectly enunciated, hung in the air like a ringing chime. "Honorable Mr. Tanaka, please forgive my impertinence. It is presumptuous of me to speak, but what your colleague just said, I believe it may be slightly mistaken." Kenji Tanaka froze mid-turn. His entire body went rigid. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his head, then his entire body, to face the source of the voice. His eyes, which had been dismissive and opaque, were now wide with utter, unadulterated astonishment. He stared at Clara, this young woman in a simple, black server's uniform, as if she had just recited a sacred, forgotten text. His 2 associates looked equally stunned, their mouths slightly agape. The American side of the table was a portrait of pure, uncomprehending chaos. They didn't understand the words, but they understood the tone. They saw the seismic shift in the room's atmosphere. They saw the Japanese delegation's shock, and it was a more powerful communication than anything that had been said all night. Julian Croft's face cycled through a rapid series of emotions. Bewilderment, then irritation, and finally a surge of pure, white-hot fury. Who was this girl? A waitress? How dare she? "What is going on?" he demanded, his voice a harsh rasp. "Who said that? You?" He pointed a trembling finger at Clara. "What did you just say?" Clara's heart was a wild bird, beating against the cage of her ribs. The adrenaline was a roaring fire in her ears. The sheer, terrifying audacity of what she had just done washed over her, and for a second she felt her knees weaken. She, the invisible servant, had given voice in a room of kings. But she didn't look at Julian. Her focus remained entirely on Mr. Tanaka. She held his gaze, her expression one of profound respect, but also of quiet, unshakable conviction. The artist in her, the student of her grandmother, had taken over. This was a dialogue, not a transgression. Mr. Tanaka took a step towards her. His eyes scanned her face, searching for some explanation for this impossible reality. He replied in Japanese, his voice no longer flat, but filled with a cautious, profound curiosity. You speak our language." It was less a question and more a statement of disbelief. "Yes, sir," Clara replied, maintaining the formal address. "Sobo ni osowarimashita. My grandmother taught me. Your language, your philosophy, they were the world of my childhood." The choice of words was deliberate. The world of my childhood. It conveyed a depth of immersion and love that went far beyond a simple language course. It was a signal to him that she wasn't just a translator, she was a keeper of the culture. On the American side, the confusion was boiling over into outrage. "Marcus, what are they saying?" Julian snapped, turning on his junior executive. Marcus Thorne looked pale and utterly lost. I don't know, sir. She's speaking very quickly. It's a very formal, old dialect, I think." It wasn't an old dialect. It was just pure, articulate, respectful Japanese, and Marcus's inability to even grasp it exposed his earlier claims as the pathetic charade they were. Eleanor Vance, however, was watching the interaction with a shrewd, calculating look. She wasn't seeing a waitress anymore. She was seeing an unexpected, improbable lifeline. "Shut up, Marcus," Julian seethed, his eyes locked on Clara. "You, waitress, what is your name?" "Clara Evans, sir," she said, her voice steady, though her hands, hidden behind her back, were trembling. "Miss Evans," Julian said, his voice dripping with sarcasm and menace. "You are fired. Get your things and get out of my sight. You have no idea of the damage you have just caused." He turned back to the Japanese delegation, intending to offer a final, desperate apology for the interruption from his staff. But Mr. Tanaka wasn't looking at him. He was still looking at Clara. He held up a hand, a clear, commanding gesture for Julian to stop. He addressed Clara again in Japanese. "You said my colleague was mistaken. Explain yourself. What did you find to be in error?" This was it. The precipice. She could apologize, scurry away, and accept her fate as an unemployed waitress, or she could double down on the most insane gamble of her life. She took a deep breath, the scent of green tea and ozone filling her lungs. "Your colleague," she began, her Japanese flowing with a natural, unforced grace, spoke of American impatience. He suggested that your hosts build things that glitter but do not last. While I understand his frustration, which stems from a profound failure of communication, to label it as a lack of substance is to mistake the symptom for the disease. She paused, letting the words settle in the silent room. Mr. Tanaka's expression was now one of intense concentration. He was no longer looking at a waitress. He was listening to a thesis. "The issue here," Clara continued, gaining confidence with every sentence, "is not a lack of substance. It is a difference in the philosophy of creation. Mr. Croft and his team see the world through the lens of code. A line of code is either perfect or it is broken. If it is broken, you delete it and write a new one. It is a world of constant, rapid replacement, a world of version 2.0. She gestured subtly towards Mr. Tanaka. "You, Tanaka-sama, and your company. You see the world through a different lens. The lens of the master craftsman. When a master's tool gains a nick, he does not discard it. He sharpens it. When a fortress wall cracks, you do not demolish it. You reinforce it. You build upon the history, you don't erase it. She looked from Julian's furious, confused face to Mr. Tanaka's astonished one. He is not speaking of glittering things that do not last. He is speaking of a world that is constantly, fearlessly, renewing itself. You are speaking of a world that honors its foundations above all else. He is speaking the language of the microprocessor. You are speaking the language of the cherry blossom tree, and you have no interpreter. As she finished, the room was so quiet she could hear the frantic beat of her own heart. She had laid it all bare. She had diagnosed the core philosophical divide that millions of dollars in consulting fees had failed to identify. She had done it in a language nobody on the American side understood, defending the very man who had just fired her to the man he had been trying to win over. Julian Croft stood there, utterly powerless, a king in his own castle rendered a peasant by a language he could not speak. His face was a mask of rage, confusion, and a tiny, dawning flicker of something he would never admit to. Awe. Mr. Tanaka stared at Clara for a long, unblinking moment. Then he turned to Julian Croft, and for the first time that night he spoke to him in slow, heavily accented, but perfectly clear English. "Mr. Croft," he said, his voice a low rumble, "we will not be leaving just yet." He then gestured, not with a finger, but with an open, respectful hand, towards the empty interpreter's chair at the table. "And this young woman, Miss Evans, she is not fired." His gaze was resolute. The command was absolute. "She will sit." For a moment, nobody moved. The universe seemed to hold its breath. Julian Croft looked as if Mr. Tanaka had just slapped him across the face. He, the CEO of Nexus Forge, in his own private booking, had just been countermanded by a foreign national regarding his own employee. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted by a waitress in a black uniform. Eleanor Vance was the first to react. She gave Clara a subtle but firm nod, her eyes conveying a clear, urgent message. "Do as he says. This is our only chance." Still in a state of profound shock, Clara walked from the relative safety of the wall to the gleaming black table. The few steps felt like a mile. She was acutely aware of the cheap, rubber-soled shoes she wore, a stark contrast to the polished Italian leather surrounding the table. She pulled out the heavy, ornate chair, the same one the disgraced interpreter had occupied hours earlier, and sat down. The starched fabric of her uniform felt coarse and out of place against the chair's plush leather. She folded her hands on the table, her server's instincts warring with the terrifying new reality of her position. "Now," Mr. Tanaka said, reverting to Japanese and addressing Clara directly. Croft-san was attempting to speak of synergy. It is a word we know from the West, but his meaning was a ghost. "Tell me, what is his vision for this synergy?" Not in his clumsy words, but in a way that a man who builds machines, meant to last for 100 years, would understand. All eyes turned to Clara. Julian's gaze was a toxic cocktail of suspicion, humiliation, and grudging desperation. He was trapped. His entire empire, his legacy, was now inexplicably in the hands of a waitress whose name he hadn't known 10 minutes ago. Clara turned to him. Her voice was quiet, but steady. "Mr. Croft, Mr. Tanaka asks you to explain your vision for the synergy between the two companies. He asks that you explain it, not as a businessman talking about market share, but as an engineer talking about a perfect machine. Julian blinked, momentarily thrown. He was used to speaking in terms of quarterly growth, user acquisition, and disruptive verticals. As an engineer? Yes, sir, Clara said. He is a man who honors the integrity of a design. He wants to understand what you truly intend to build with him. The reframing of the question was a revelation. It sliced through the corporate jargon and hit the heart of the matter. Julian was silent for a moment, the formidable gears in his brain turning at high speed. He looked at Mr. Tanaka, truly looked at him for the first time, not as a stubborn obstacle, but as a fellow creator. "Okay," he said, his tone changing. The raw anger was gone, replaced by a focused intensity. "Okay, tell him this." He began to speak, and Clara began to translate. But she wasn't just translating, she was transmuting. When Julian said, "We will leverage your legacy hardware and precision manufacturing to create a feedback loop for our agile AI development," Clara didn't just repeat the words in Japanese. She paused, processed the core idea, and then conveyed its soul. "Tanaka-sama," she would say, her voice imbued with a newfound confidence. "Mr. Croft sees your company's history not as a static object to be used, but as a wise and experienced teacher. He believes the discipline and exactitude of your methods can provide the strong, unwavering foundation that his company's speed and agility currently lack. He imagines it not as two separate parts, but as a single, perfectly balanced organism. Your deep roots will nourish his rapid growth, and his growth will provide new sunlight for your leaves. One cannot thrive without the other." As she spoke, a visible change came over Kenji Tanaka. His rigid posture softened. He leaned forward, listening with an intensity that bordered on reverence. He began to nod, not just in politeness, but in genuine, dawning understanding. He began to ask questions, complex, philosophical questions disguised as technical inquiries. He asked about the longevity of software, about how an algorithm could possess honor. Julian, in turn, answered with a fluency and passion for his own work that had been buried under layers of executive bravado. He spoke of creating AI that learned and adapted with the wisdom of experience, not just the brute force of data. And with every exchange, Clara was the bridge. She didn't just swap nouns and verbs, she found the right cultural and technical idioms. She transformed Julian's talk of disruptive innovation into the Japanese concept of kaizen, continuous, respectful improvement. She converted his aggressive, market penetration strategies into a more palatable discussion of building a long-term, sustainable presence that earned the trust of the community. She was in her element. The years of listening to her grandmother's stories, of absorbing the quiet philosophy of wabi-sabi, finding beauty in imperfection, of understanding that true strength lay in resilience, not flawless perfection. It was all flooding back. This wasn't just a translation. It was a live performance of her grandmother's wisdom. She was connecting the dots, explaining the nuances, and revealing the shared values that had been lying dormant beneath the surface of their conflict. Eleanor Vance watched, mesmerized. She saw Clara's innate genius. It wasn't just about language, it was about emotional and cultural intelligence of the highest possible order. She made a mental note to pull every file the restaurant had on Clara Evans. Marcus Thorne, however, was shrinking in his chair. With every fluent, elegant sentence Clara uttered, his own blustering incompetence was thrown into sharper, more humiliating relief. He had tried to be the hero. Now he was less than a spectator. He was a monument to the very problem Clara was solving. A bitter, resentful jealousy began to coil in his gut. After an hour of intense, productive conversation, a waiter, one of Clara's colleagues, approached the table to clear the main course plates, which had grown cold long ago. He looked at Clara, sitting at the table with the titans of industry, his face a mask of utter bewilderment. Clara gave him a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head, and he retreated in confusion. Finally, Mr. Tanaka raised a hand. He looked from Julian to Clara, and a small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. He spoke in Japanese. "Miss Evans, there is a section in the final pages of the contract. Our legal team calls it the Heritage Proviso. Mr. Croft's representative," he glanced briefly at Marcus, "has dismissed it as non-binding, sentimental fluff. He wishes to strike it from the document. This has been the primary sticking point for a week. I want you to explain it to Mr. Croft. Explain why it is not sentimental, but the very spine of this agreement." Clara's blood ran cold. The Heritage Proviso. She had no idea what it was. She was a waitress, not a corporate lawyer. This was beyond her. The fragile confidence she had built over the last hour threatened to shatter into 1,000,000 pieces. "Sir," she said to Julian, her voice wavering for the first time. "He is referring to a specific clause in the contract, the Heritage Proviso. He says your team wants it removed, and that it is the main reason the deal has stalled." Julian's face darkened. The Heritage Proviso. It's a page of meaningless poetry. It talks about honoring the spirit of the founder and community stewardship. It has no legal teeth. It's unenforceable. Our lawyers, quite rightly, want it gone. It creates potential liabilities based on vague emotions. Clara looked back at Mr. Tanaka, then at Julian. She was caught in the crossfire of the single most important disagreement of the entire merger, and she was completely out of her depth. The pressure in the room suddenly refocused, narrowing to a single point right where she sat. The brief camaraderie forged through philosophical discussion evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard reality of a legal impasse. "Tell Mr. Tanaka," Julian said, his voice clipped and impatient, "that our legal team is the best in the world. If they say the clause is a liability, it's a liability. We can issue a press release about honoring his company's history. We can name a building after his great-grandfather. But we will not put vague, emotional language into a $12 billion contract." Clara took a deep breath, her mind racing. She had to choose her words with the precision of a surgeon. A direct translation of Julian's dismissive tone would detonate the fragile peace she had built. She turned to Mr. Tanaka. "Tanaka-sama," she began in Japanese. "Mr. Croft acknowledges the profound significance of your company's history. However, his legal advisors are concerned that the current wording of the Heritage Proviso, being rooted in principle rather than precise legal definitions, could create unforeseen complications. They prefer to honor the spirit of the clause through public commitments, rather than contractual obligation." She had softened the edges, but the core message was the same. The clause was a problem. Mr. Tanaka listened, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his portfolio and pulled out a single sheet of paper, which he slid across the table to Clara. It was a copy of the proviso, written in Japanese. "Read it," he commanded. "Read it not with the eyes of a lawyer, but with the eyes of a granddaughter. Then you will understand." Clara picked up the paper. Her hands trembled slightly. The text was not dense legal jargon. It was, as Julian had said, almost poetic. But beneath the poetry was a framework of iron. It spoke of the company's duty not just to its shareholders, but to its employees and the city of Osaka where it was founded. It stipulated that for a period of 50 years, the original factory could not be closed, and that the company would maintain its apprenticeship program, which trained local youth in the art of precision engineering. It mandated that a percentage of profits be reinvested into the community's cultural preservation. It wasn't fluff. It was a covenant. It was the soul of his company, codified on paper. It was everything her grandmother had ever taught her about duty, community, and the responsibility that comes with creation. Julian's team saw a liability. Mr. Tanaka saw a promise to his ancestors. Then, Clara saw something else. At the bottom of the page was a small typed annotation in English, initialed MT. It read, "Client fixated on this honor clause. Recommend removal. Sentimental, no quantifiable value, potential PR headache. Frame as unenforceable to our side." Empty Marcus Thorne. Her eyes flickered towards him. He was watching her, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. He had been the one interfacing with the Japanese legal team. He had been the one to frame this clause for Julian's lawyers, and he had taken a concept of profound cultural and social responsibility, geary, and actively, deliberately reduced it to sentimental fluff. He hadn't just failed to translate, he had committed an act of cultural vandalism, whether through ignorance or a malicious attempt to simplify the issue for his superiors. The result was the same, a catastrophic misrepresentation. He had positioned the heart of the deal as a cancerous tumor to be excised. This was the real problem. The foundation of the entire negotiation had been built on a lie. "I understand," Clara said softly, looking up from the paper directly at Mr. Tanaka. Her voice was filled with a new, quiet authority. She turned to Julian. "Sir, with all due respect to your legal team, they have been given a profoundly, fundamentally inaccurate understanding of what this clause represents. The man who advised them," she glanced pointedly at Marcus Thorne, who flinched as if struck, labeled this clause as sentimental. That is not a translation error. That is a complete failure of comprehension. "What are you talking about?" Julian demanded, his eyes narrowing. "This isn't a legacy clause, sir," Clara explained, her voice gaining passion. "In Japanese, the concept it's built around is giri. It doesn't have a perfect English equivalent. It's a deep, binding sense of social and moral duty to your family, your employees, your community. This paragraph isn't about feelings. It's a structural guarantee. It's his company's constitution. It's a promise to his people and his city that this merger won't strip the company of its soul. It's a promise that Nexus Forge won't just buy the factories, but that it will inherit the responsibility that comes with them." She slid the paper across the table to Julian. "He's not asking for a plaque, Mr. Croft. He's asking you to become a custodian of a 100-year-old trust. He is testing you. He needs to know if you are a partner who will uphold that trust, or an acquirer who will strip his company for parts and discard the community it was built to support." The room was silent. Clara had just performed open-heart surgery on the deal, laying bare the blockage that had been slowly killing it for weeks. She had recontextualized the entire conflict, moving it from a legal squabble to a profound question of character and intent. Julian Croft stared at the paper, then at Clara, then at the suddenly terrified-looking Marcus Thorne. The pieces were clicking into place in his mind with the speed of a supercomputer processing a complex problem. The weeks of frustration, the reports from Marcus about the stubborn and emotional Japanese, the inexplicable friction, it all suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. He had been fighting the wrong war on the wrong battlefield because his own scout had given him a faulty map. Eleanor Vance looked at Marcus Thorne with eyes of ice. His career at Nexus Forge was over. She knew it. He knew it. And Julian was just beginning to realize it. Finally, Julian looked at Kenji Tanaka. The anger and frustration were gone, replaced by a dawning, grudging respect. He had been tested, and he had been failing. "Ask him," Julian said to Clara, his voice low and serious, "if he would give me the honor of explaining how I intend to be that custodian." Clara turned back to Kenji Tanaka, her role shifting once more. She was no longer just an interpreter of words, but a facilitator of understanding, the chief architect of a bridge being built across a cultural canyon. "Tanaka-sama," she relayed, her Japanese formal, yet imbued with the gravity of the moment. "Mr. Croft wishes to express his profound regret. He confesses that he has been viewing this document through the wrong lens. He asks for the honor of explaining to you not his legal position, but his personal commitment to becoming a custodian of the trust your family has built." The choice of the word "eyo," honor, was crucial. It resonated with Mr. Tanaka's traditional values. For the first time all evening, the Japanese CEO leaned back in his chair, a sign that he was prepared to listen. Truly listen. And so began the most important negotiation of Julian Croft's life. It was a negotiation not of numbers or terms, but of principles. Guided by Clara's questions, prompted by her nuanced understanding of what Mr. Tanaka needed to hear, Julian began to speak. He didn't talk about maximizing profits. He talked about his own grandfather, a man who had been a watchmaker, a man who had taught him that the beauty of a machine was in how its smallest parts worked together in perfect harmony. He spoke of the pride of creating something tangible, of providing jobs, of building a community around his first small office in a garage in Palo Alto. He admitted that in the rush to grow his global corporation, he had sometimes lost sight of those founding principles. Clara translated it all. She captured the hint of vulnerability in Julian's voice, the genuine regret, and the newfound respect. She conveyed it to Mr. Tanaka, not as a calculated business tactic, but as a sincere confession from one creator to another. "Tell him," Julian said, leaning forward, his hands flat on the table, "that I see now. The heritage proviso is not a liability. It is the core operating system. It's a quality control mechanism for the company's soul, and I will not remove it. I will sign it, and I will give him my personal guarantee, as a man, that I will uphold it." When Clara translated this, a stillness fell upon the Japanese delegation. Mr. Tanaka looked at Julian, studying his face intently, searching for any sign of insincerity. He found none. The American CEO, who hours before had been a caricature of impatience and arrogance, now looked like a statesman. Mr. Tanaka then asked a series of sharp, probing questions. What did Julian know of the Japanese concept of lifetime employment? How would he ensure the plant manager in Osaka had the autonomy to make decisions that benefited the local community, even if they didn't show immediate returns on a quarterly report? These were questions Julian's team had never even considered. But with Clara there to explain the context behind them, Julian rose to the challenge. He didn't offer canned corporate answers. He offered creative, collaborative solutions. He suggested forming a joint heritage committee, co-chaired by Mr. Tanaka himself, to oversee the implementation of the proviso. He proposed funding a new technology and arts program at the local high school in Osaka, blending his world with theirs. He wasn't just agreeing to the clause, he was embracing it, building upon it. The atmosphere in the room was transformed. The chill had dissipated, replaced by a palpable warmth of mutual respect and excitement. Mr. Tanaka's two associates, who had been so stoic before, were now smiling, murmuring to each other in appreciative tones. Finally, After nearly 2 more hours of constructive dialogue, Kenji Tanaka stood up. Julian Croft and his team immediately rose as well. Mr. Tanaka walked around the table until he stood directly in front of Clara. He looked down at her, his dark eyes no longer opaque, but filled with a deep, sincere gratitude. "Evan-san," he said in Japanese, his voice resonating with emotion. "In my 78 years, I have worked with ambassadors, ministers, and the most expensive consultants in the world. I can say without hesitation that you are the most effective communicator I have ever met. You did not just translate our words tonight. You translated our intentions. You translated our souls." He then switched to his careful English for everyone to hear. "You have saved this great enterprise." He turned to Julian and extended his hand. "Mr. Croft, we have a deal. Send me the contract tomorrow. Do not change a single word of the heritage proviso." Julian grasped his hand firmly, a wide, genuine smile breaking across his face. "You have my word, Kenji." The handshake was firm, the relief in the room so thick it was almost a physical presence. The deal was done. As the two CEOs spoke, sharing a quiet laugh, Eleanor Vance approached Clara, who was still seated, looking slightly dazed by the whirlwind of events. "That was the most extraordinary thing I have ever witnessed in my career," Eleanor said, her voice low and full of awe. Before Clara could respond, Julian turned his attention to his disgraced junior executive. His voice, now devoid of heat, was chillingly cold. "Marcus," he said, not even looking at him, "Eleanor will be waiting for you in her office at 8 a.m. tomorrow. Bring your resignation." Marcus Thorne stared at Julian, his face a mess of panic and shame. He opened his mouth to protest, but a single withering look from Julian silenced him. He grabbed his briefcase and practically fled the room without another word. The path of destruction caused by his ignorance and ambition was finally cleared, and in its place stood Clara, the quiet waitress, who had single-handedly salvaged a multi-billion-dollar legacy. Robert Sterling now turned to her, his expression a complex mixture of gratitude, embarrassment, and sheer astonishment. "Miss Evans," he began, "I owe you an apology, and a debt I'm not sure I can ever repay." The aftermath of the handshake was surreal. The Japanese delegation, now warm and talkative, were sharing a celebratory glass of Hibiki whiskey with Julian and Eleanor. The tension of the evening had vanished so completely, it felt like a distant, nightmarish dream. In the center of it all, Clara sat, an island of quiet disbelief. She had come into this room to pour tea, and she was leaving it, having reshaped the future of 2 global corporations. Julian, after concluding his conversation with Mr. Tanaka, walked over to her. He pulled up a chair and sat down, not as a CEO addressing a waitress, but as a man acknowledging a peer. "I was wrong," he said, his voice stripped of all its earlier arrogance. "I was rude, I was dismissive, and I was about to fire the single most valuable person in this city. I am truly sorry." "It's all right, Mr. Croft," Clara murmured, still overwhelmed. "You were under a lot of pressure." "That's an excuse, not a reason," he countered. "What you did tonight, it wasn't just translation, it was alchemy. You have a gift, Miss Evans, a profound understanding of people that's rarer than any patent." He paused, studying her. "Eleanor ran a background check while I was talking to Kenji," he admitted without a trace of shame. "Art history scholarship, top of your class, glowing recommendations. Then, nothing. You just disappeared from the grid." He shook his head in wonder. "What happened?" The question was direct, but his tone was gentle, genuinely curious. For the first time in years, Clara felt no shame in telling her story. She spoke of her grandmother, her mother's illness, the mountain of debt, and her little brother Sam, who she was trying to put through school. She spoke of the dream she'd had to lock away, the life of art and history she had been forced to abandon. Julian listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. "You sacrificed your future for your family," he stated simply. "That's Giri. That's heritage. The very thing I was too blind to see in Tanaka's contract. You've been living it every single day." He stood up. "This isn't a job offer, Miss Evans, because what you're doing now is not your job. This is a course correction. For both of us." The offer that came next wasn't impulsive. It was calculated, logical, and born of a newfound wisdom. "I'm not going to offer you a VP title overnight. That's a fairy tale, and this is business. But I am offering you a position as a senior consultant, effective immediately, attached to my personal office. Your first assignment is to see this merger through to its final integration. You will be my advisor on all matters related to Tanaka Industries. You will travel with me to Osaka next month. Your compensation will be a consulting fee that will erase your family's debt and cover your brother's entire education, with plenty left over. After 6 months, we will reevaluate and define a permanent role for you at Nexus Forge, a role that you will help create." It was a practical, respectful, and incredibly generous offer. It wasn't a handout, it was a challenge. It gave her a chance to prove her worth beyond one miraculous night. Clara stared at him, speechless. I don't know what to say." "Say you'll think about it," Eleanor Hayes said, joining them with a warm smile. "But please don't think for too long. Believe me, Clara, we need you more than you know." As the Japanese delegation prepared to leave, Mr. Tanaka approached her one last time. He handed her a simple, elegant business card made of cedar wood. "Evans-san," he said in Japanese, a twinkle in his eye. "If this young man ever fails to appreciate the beauty of what has been broken and mended, you call me. There will always be a place for you at Tanaka Industries, the very highest place." Tears welled in Clara's eyes as she accepted the card. They were not tears of sadness or relief, but of a profound, overwhelming sense of restoration. The part of her she thought was dead and buried, the scholar, the artist, the strategist, was alive and well. It had been there all along, waiting for a chance to speak. An hour later, Clara walked out of Sakura's Peak for the last time. The cold Manhattan wind hit her face, but she barely felt it. She wasn't an invisible waitress anymore. She was Clara Evans, the woman who understood the art of mending broken things, the one who could hear the silent language of the soul. Her past was not a tragedy that had derailed her. It was the forge that had shaped her. And her future was no longer a question of surviving until the next paycheck, but of striding into a boardroom in Osaka, ready to build something that would not just glitter, but last. She thought of her grandmother's hands, carefully tracing a crack with gold. The break wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of its true beauty.